In the autumn of 2021, a software engineer in Austin, Texas, named David Park did something that at the time felt almost radical. He walked into a dealership and drove out in a brand new electric sedan, leaving behind a 3-year-old Honda Accord that had served him without complaint. His reasons were not ideological. He had sat down one evening with a spreadsheet, pulling numbers from the Department of Energy, from AAA cost studies, and from his own utility bills, and the arithmetic seemed to favor the switch. 5 years of fuel savings, reduced maintenance, a federal tax credit that would offset a significant portion of the price premium. The math on paper was clean. What David did not account for, and what almost no one at that point was accounting for, were the dozens of hidden variables that would reveal themselves month by month, year by year, in ways that no spreadsheet could have predicted. His experience, and the experiences of millions of others who made similar calculations, would become a quiet case study in the distance between economic theory and lived financial reality. To understand what a 5-year ownership comparison between an electric vehicle and a gasoline car actually reveals, you have to first abandon the idea that there is a single answer. The question itself, framed simply as which costs less, carries an assumption of universality that the data resists at every turn: where you live, how you charge, what you drive, how far you commute, whether you own a home with a garage, whether electricity in your state costs 9 cents per kilowatt hour or 24, whether gasoline happens to be $2.80 per gallon or $4.50 during the years you own the car. Every one of these variables reshapes the equation so completely that two people buying the same vehicle in the same month can arrive at wildly different 5-year totals. The honest answer to the question, the one that rarely makes for a compelling headline, is that it depends. And what it depends on is worth understanding in some detail. The most visible number, and the one that frames the entire ownership period, is the purchase price. As of early 2026, the average transaction price for a new electric vehicle in the United States hovered around $55,300. The average for a new gasoline car sat roughly $6,500 lower, near $48,800. That gap has narrowed considerably from where it stood 3 or 4 years ago, when the difference could exceed $12,000, but it remains meaningful for many buyers. That initial premium defines the entire psychology of ownership. Everything that follows, the fuel savings, the lower maintenance bills, the insurance premiums, gets measured against that upfront number, often unconsciously. People who buy electric vehicles tend to spend their first year or two mentally tracking whether their savings are closing the gap. And this tracking can color the entire experience with a sense of either vindication or regret, depending on what the numbers happen to do. Until late September of 2025, a federal tax credit of up to $7,500 softened that initial premium dramatically. For qualifying vehicles assembled in North America with battery components meeting certain domestic sourcing requirements, the credit could bring the effective price gap down to near parity with a comparable gasoline model. But that credit, established under the Inflation Reduction Act, was repealed as part of sweeping legislative changes that took effect at the end of September 2025. For anyone purchasing a new electric vehicle in 2026, the full sticker price is the price. No federal offset. Some state-level incentives persist, scattered and variable, but the single largest financial argument for going electric at the point of sale has disappeared. This changes the calculus considerably, particularly for buyers who are on the fence, the very buyers for whom a cost comparison matters most. Once the vehicle is parked in your driveway, the economics begin to diverge along several distinct pathways, and fuel is the most intuitive. The Department of Energy and multiple independent analyses have consistently found that powering an electric vehicle costs substantially less per mile than fueling a gasoline car, provided you're charging at home. The numbers have been remarkably stable, roughly 4 to 6 cents per mile for a home charge EV, compared to 12 to 17 cents per mile for a gasoline vehicle with average fuel economy. Over 12,000 miles per year, that difference translates to somewhere between $600 and $1,300 in annual savings on energy alone, or roughly $3,000 to $6,500 over a 5-year period. This is not a trivial sum. For many households, it represents the single most tangible financial benefit of electric vehicle ownership. But the phrase, "provided you are charging at home," is doing enormous work in that sentence. Not everyone can charge at home. According to census data, roughly 36% of American households are renters, and among those, a significant fraction lack access to a dedicated parking space, let alone one with an electrical outlet capable of supporting a level 2 charger. For these owners, public charging becomes the primary or sole method of keeping the car running, and public charging is a fundamentally different economic proposition. Level 2 public stations typically charge 30 to 40 cents per kilowatt hour, roughly double the home rate. DC fast chargers, the kind that can replenish a battery in 30 to 45 minutes, often run 45 to 60 cents per kilowatt hour, and some networks charge even more during peak hours. At these rates, the cost per mile for an EV begins to approach and in some cases exceeds the cost per mile of a reasonably efficient gasoline car. An EV owner relying exclusively on public fast charging might spend 8 to 13 cents per mile on energy, which narrows the gap with a gasoline car, spending 14 to 17 cents per mile to something close to negligible. The fuel saving story, in other words, is really a home charging story. For the apartment dweller in a city with expensive electricity and limited infrastructure, the math looks nothing like the glossy projections. There is also the matter of electricity rate structures, which vary not only by state but by utility, by time of day, and by tier. California, the largest EV market in the country, also has some of the highest residential electricity rates, frequently exceeding 20 to 25 cents per kilowatt hour for households in higher consumption tiers. An EV owner in the San Joaquin Valley paying those rates gets a very different deal than an EV owner in Washington state, where hydroelectric power keeps rates near 10 cents. The geographical dimension of this comparison is one of its most underappreciated features. In states where gasoline is cheap and electricity is expensive, the per-mile fuel savings can shrink to almost nothing. In states where the reverse is true, the savings can be dramatic. National averages, the numbers most frequently cited in these comparisons, conceal enormous local variation. Maintenance is the second major cost category, and it is where electric vehicles hold perhaps their most durable advantage. The fundamental engineering reality is straightforward. An electric drivetrain has far fewer moving parts than an internal combustion engine. There are no oil changes, no timing belts, no spark plugs, no transmission fluid, no exhaust system to corrode. Regenerative braking reduces wear on brake pads so significantly that many EV owners go through their entire ownership period without a single brake replacement. Consumer Reports and AAA have both published studies finding that EV maintenance costs run approximately 30 to 50% lower than those of comparable gasoline vehicles, and the Department of Energy has estimated the difference at roughly 6 cents per mile for an EV versus 10 cents per mile for a gasoline car. Over 5 years and 60,000 miles, that 4 cent per mile difference adds up to approximately $2,400. However, the maintenance picture is not entirely one-sided. Electric vehicles are heavy, often 10 to 20% heavier than their gasoline counterparts, largely because of the battery pack. That weight exacts a toll on tires. EV-specific tires, designed to handle the higher loads and instant torque delivery, typically cost 20 to 30% more per tire than mainstream all-season tires for gasoline cars, and they wear out roughly 20 to 30% faster. A set of 4 EV tires might run $700 to $1,200, and some owners report needing replacement as frequently as every 25 to 35,000 miles, compared to 40 to 50,000 miles for a gasoline car on standard tires. Over 5 years, an EV owner might go through 2 or even 3 sets of tires, while a gasoline car owner gets by with 1 or 2. The tire cost differential, which rarely appears in headline comparisons, can easily reach $1,000 to $1,500 over the ownership period, eating into the maintenance advantage. Then there is the insurance line item, which has emerged as one of the more surprising, and for many owners, frustrating elements of EV ownership costs. Multiple industry analyses published through 2025 and into 2026 have found that insuring an electric vehicle costs meaningfully more than insuring a comparable gasoline car. The numbers vary by source, but the direction is consistent. One widely cited Insurify analysis put the average annual EV premium at roughly $4,000 compared to $2,700 for a gasoline vehicle, a gap of nearly 49%. Other studies have found more modest differences in the 15 to 30% range, but even at the lower end, the annual premium difference of $300 to $500 adds up to $1,500 to $2,500 over 5 years. The reasons are structural. EVs have higher repair costs after collisions, partly because battery packs can be damaged in ways that are expensive to assess and address, and partly because the specialized components and labor required for EV bodywork remain more costly than those for conventional vehicles. Insurers price this risk accordingly, and for now the gap shows little sign of closing. Depreciation, however, is where the 5-year comparison takes its most dramatic and often least anticipated turn. For most vehicle owners, depreciation is the largest single cost of ownership, exceeding fuel, maintenance, and insurance combined. And here, the data is unambiguous. Electric vehicles have been depreciating faster than gasoline cars by a significant margin. A March 2025 analysis by IC Cars found that the average EV lost approximately 59% of its value over 5 years, compared to roughly 46% for the overall market. Other studies have placed the EV 5-year depreciation rate in the 50 to 60% range, while gasoline cars typically land in the low to mid-40s. On a $55,000 EV, a 60% depreciation rate means a residual value of around $22,000, a loss of $33,000. On a $49,000 gasoline car, depreciating at 45%. The residual is roughly $27,000, a loss of $22,000. The difference, $11,000, dwarfs the fuel and maintenance savings combined. The reasons for this accelerated depreciation are multiple and interrelated. Battery technology is improving rapidly, which means a 3-year-old EV with a particular range and charging speed is competing against newer models that go farther, charge faster, and often cost less. The pace of technological improvement paradoxically punishes early adopters by making their vehicles feel obsolete more quickly. Federal and manufacturer incentives, when they were available, also compressed used EV prices by making new ones artificially cheaper. And range anxiety, whether rational or not, continues to depress demand in the used EV market relative to used gasoline cars. The result is that the single largest cost of owning an EV, the value it sheds while you own it, has been substantially greater than the equivalent cost for a gasoline car. There are, of course, important caveats. Depreciation rates vary enormously by brand and model. Certain electric vehicles, particularly some Tesla models and a few others with strong brand loyalty, have retained value better than the category average. And as the used EV market matures, as battery health data becomes more transparent and buyer confidence grows, depreciation rates may moderate. But over the specific 5-year window, most comparisons examine the aggregate data tells a clear story. Depreciation has been the great equalizer, offsetting much or all of the operational savings that electric vehicles genuinely deliver. When you assemble all of these components into a single total, the picture that emerges is more nuanced and more closely contested than either camp in the EV debate typically acknowledges. A CNET analysis published in late 2025 calculated the 5-year total cost of ownership for a representative EV at approximately $42,800 and for a comparable gasoline car at approximately $43,100, a difference of roughly $300. The margins were that thin. AAA's own annual cost studies have reached similar conclusions, finding that while EVs save money on fuel and maintenance, higher purchase prices, insurance premiums, and depreciation largely neutralize those gains. The overall cost per mile, when everything is included, tends to land within a few cents of parity for vehicles in similar classes. This near parity is itself a remarkable development because it represents a significant improvement from where things stood even 5 years ago, when EVs were clearly more expensive to own on a total cost basis. The trend line favors electric vehicles. Battery prices have been falling steadily from over $400 per kilowatt hour in 2012 to roughly $80 to $90 per kilowatt hour by 2026, according to Bloomberg Neff and Goldman Sachs projections. As battery costs decline, purchase prices should follow, which would in turn reduce depreciation losses in absolute dollar terms. Insurance markets may also adjust as repair networks develop and data accumulates. The trajectory, in other words, suggests that the cost equation will continue to shift in favor of EVs, but the shift is gradual, measured in years rather than months. What the raw numbers cannot capture, and what makes any simple comparison inherently incomplete, is the degree to which these costs are distributed unevenly across different kinds of owners. A homeowner in a mild climate with solar panels and a level 2 charger in the garage, driving a modestly priced EV purchase with a tax credit in 2024, could genuinely be thousands of dollars ahead over 5 years compared to an equivalent gasoline car. That person exists and their savings are real. But a renter in a cold climate, relying on public fast charging, paying high insurance rates in a state with expensive electricity and no remaining purchase incentives, could be several $1,000s worse off. That person also exists, and their costs are equally real. The national average sits somewhere between these poles, but almost no individual lands exactly on the national average. The average, in a sense, describes a person who does not exist. There is one additional dimension that 5-year cost comparisons typically omit or at most acknowledge in a footnote, which is the question of what happens in years 6, 7, or 8. The battery pack, the single most expensive component in an electric vehicle, is typically warranted for 8 years or 100,000 miles, and most modern packs show minimal degradation within that window. But beyond it, the replacement costs, still ranging from $5,000 to $20,000 depending on the vehicle, represents a financial cliff that has no equivalent in gasoline car ownership. An engine rebuild or transmission replacement on a gasoline car can be expensive, certainly, but the probability of needing one within the first decade of normal driving is low. The probability of needing a battery replacement within that same window is also low. But the fear of it, the psychological weight of knowing that a potential 5-figure expense lurks just beyond the warranty horizon, affects resale values and ownership decisions in ways that distort the 5-year comparison itself. Some of the accelerated depreciation in EV values is, in essence, the market pricing and battery replacement risk, even if most batteries will never actually need replacing during the typical ownership period. The story of David Park, the engineer in Austin, did not end with a simple verdict. When he sat down in the autumn of 2026 to reconcile 5 years of ownership records, his Tesla Model 3 against the Honda Accord, he would have kept, otherwise the totals were closer than he had expected. He had saved substantially on fuel, roughly $4,000 over the period, and his maintenance costs had been minimal, barely $1,000 beyond tires. But his insurance had run nearly $5,000 more than it would have on the Accord, and the depreciation on his Tesla, while better than the EV average, still exceeded what the Accord would have lost by about $6,000. The tax credit he had received brought the net comparison close to even without it. He would have paid more overall. He did not regret the purchase. He told a colleague, but he would never again describe it as the obviously cheaper choice. It was a choice, with trade-offs that only became visible over time. This is perhaps the most honest conclusion any 5-year cost comparison can reach. The question of whether an electric vehicle or a gasoline car costs less to own is not a question with a fixed answer. It is a question whose answer depends on a constellation of personal, geographical, and temporal variables that shift with every tank of gas, every kilowatt hour, every insurance renewal, and every fluctuation in the used car market. The data, as of 2026, suggests near parity for many buyers, a meaningful advantage for some, and a meaningful disadvantage for others. The direction of change favors electric vehicles, driven primarily by declining battery costs and the structural advantages of a simpler drivetrain. But the pace of that change has been slower than many projections anticipated, and the removal of federal purchase incentives introduces a new headwind at precisely the moment when the technology was approaching genuine cost competitiveness. What endures beneath all the arithmetic is a more fundamental observation about how people make decisions about large purchases. We want clarity, we want a winner. We want to be told that one path is unambiguously better so that we can commit to it without reservation. The 5-year cost comparison between an electric vehicle and a gasoline car refuses to provide that clarity, not because the data is insufficient, but because the reality is genuinely complex. The honest answer, the one that respects both the data and the diversity of circumstances in which people actually live, is that the choice is closer than the advocates on either side want to admit, and that the variables that tip the balance one way or the other are deeply personal. This spreadsheet matters, but so does the garage you may or may not have, the state you happen to live in, the utility rate you happen to pay, and the number of years you intend to keep the car. The calculation is not just mathematical, it is, in the end, biographical.